just seen. For those of you who didn't get on the last thing, I'll post it later. Sorry for the confusion over the changes in how to do it, but I'm here anyway. So, anyone got anything they want to share or ask today? Just make sure they're muted. Yeah. Anyone want to start with something?
Mike.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask about the ley lines. Do you have any insight on that?
Yeah. Ley lines, obviously from an occult perspective or a New Agey type perspective, people pick up that there are sort of places of intersection or lines of where there's power, spiritual connection, whatever. Essentially, ley lines are a residue of the power grid that was when the everlasting doors were all open and the glory of God was pouring out onto the earth. They are what's left of that residue within the fabric of the planet, and there is power or a residue of something that people pick up and feel that these are important places, or often churches are built on the intersection of those, or people hold sacrifices in these places. So there is something about it, and therefore we need to understand, is there something we need to do? And I know some people have got specific mandates to be authorized to operate in ley lines or on ley lines to ensure that nothing negative is going on, and we deal with potentially what has gone on. So there may well have been covenants made or things made on those lines that we have to undo or deal with, and from a heavenly perspective deal with. Again, I would never deal with one unless I was authorized to do so, and I've never really felt engaged in anything like that, but I know other people do, and I think Pamela has a mandate for a particular ley line. And sometimes you find that along those ley lines cities are built, and along there activity can take place, which is things that are in a sense in the ground, in the land, that we have to deal with. But it's not like we need to go and seek out a ley line to do things on. It's more like we need to ensure that whatever else is being done on those ley lines is legislated, and we make sure there's no negative things going on. If we're directed to do something on a ley line, in a city on a ley line, then great, go ahead, see whatever God authorizes you to do on it. But they are definitely, they are there. They are discernible, and even from a scriptural perspective. Yeah, I already called her, but yeah, even from a scriptural perspective, we know there are things like boundary stones, which are words spoken into a stone, which was set up, which then stopped the enemy crossing. And you had Gideon, I think Samuel spoke into the fabric of things, and everything that exists has the capacity to store a record of things that have gone on. So within their fabric, they can store a memory of things that happen, and hence why you find some places are dark places, some places are light places. So yeah, it's one of those things. I mean, I've actually got a couple of pieces of stone that actually are from various places that have had things spoken to them. One piece of stone I got from David Vancouverin, which was a piece of stone that was where Joshua decreed and declared some things, and I got another piece of stone from David Vancouver, someone who's in David Vancouveren's ministry, who gave me a piece of stone that also had some associations. For me, I'm not really necessarily into that sort of stuff myself. You know, I sort of deal with more heavenly stuff and outworking stuff, but I know others are, and if you feel led, you need to make sure you're authorized. Don't step outside of any level of authority that you've got. You know, it can be dangerous if you try and tackle something outside of the governmental sphere that you have. You know, so I would never do that. But you know, yeah. You know, I don't know if anyone else got anything they want to share on that. I know Pamela definitely has got some authority in the area of ley lines. You got anything you want to share on that?
Yeah, it was interesting because the Lord showed us a group of four across the country from New York to California. He brought up the word ley line. And, you know, we had to do research. And it was as if he was redeeming this power grid or this, you know, power structure where they communicate, where the enemy communicates and moves about. And he was redeeming it and setting up CCC over it. So, I mean, he brought up the name ley line, and we were like, what? And we started looking to see what it meant. So, yeah. Just, I guess, just part of the restoration of all things.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Definitely so. Yeah. No, I definitely, definitely can see where, you know, there are roles to play in it. But you know, again, it's being led and directed as the Spirit leads you, and you know, in that way, you're on safe ground because you're only going to follow the directions that you're given, rather than sort of, you know, in a lot of these things. I know a lot of people get fascinated, or they get drawn to some of the things and research them and do things about it. You know, I'm really not that interested in what the enemy does. You know, I'm really looking for, you know, what is God doing, and what does He want me to do about anything that the enemy might be doing, rather than, you know, my own personal sort of inquisitiveness or curiosity. You know, and I know, you know, that some people are curious about things and they go into them, and you know, that can lead to problems. But so you have to be really knowing that you're authorized, and then, you know, go with that. You know. But, yeah.
I've had a couple experiences where after ascension and coming back, God has caused our group to land on the ley lines.
Yeah.
And they totally light up, or there's an explosion that happens. And so I'm glad you said that word about redeeming, because I believe He is. You know, He's restoring all things, and why would we give the residue of, you know, what the everlasting door, I don't know, how did you explain that again, something about the everlasting doors?
Yeah, well, in a sense, what we should be doing is opening the everlasting doors and seeing heaven manifesting on earth, which is what we do when we engage in heaven sometimes, and then we come back down and we engage. We're bringing something of heaven into the earth. So our responsibility is to legislate the everlasting doors to open up so the glory of God can be poured out, and that will obviously be associated with certain places and things, because there is a grid, and those everlasting doors, you know, are over our own personal spheres of government. They are over our ecclesias and other areas of government, so they are physically located, you know, and there may be things that we're authorized to do to legislate the ongoing outworking of God's glory in those places, and heaven engaging those places, rather than what's the residue. I'm not. The residue is just the residue which people are attracted to. What we must do is actually not to see a residue. We need to see the fulfillment of what God's original purpose was. So if we're, you know, I know that there are cities of refuge, ecclesias, that are called to be established under everlasting doors, which then will become places of power on the earth, hubs, you know, embassies, gardens of heaven on earth. They will be fulfilling God's purpose in, you know, bringing the earth back to restoration to his original plan. So rather than actually, okay, well, yes, there's a residue, actually what we need to do is open the everlasting door and make sure that it's not just a residue. We want to see the fullness of the glory of God filling the earth. So the glory of God fills the earth as the waters cover the sea. That will be a fulfillment of what was there originally, but won't just be a residue, will be a power. And then when we are operating in the power of God and there's heaven operating on earth, anyone who's drawn to any of those things is going to come up against God's power in fullness, not just a residue that they then begin to use and think that that's a special place that they can do their things and then claim the ground. So it's very much about us effectively governing, ruling, and establishing the kingdom in those places so that we have that in its fullness. And so, yes, there's a sense of redeeming, but there's a sense of restoring and fulfilling, in which we take authority over those positions, those areas that God is calling us to administrate from. And, you know, I don't understand why the everlasting doors are, in a sense, in some sort of pattern, but God's chosen to do so in some sort of pattern. That's why there are territories, that's why there are territorial spirits and principalities and powers and different things. Some of what we have to do is establish the right atmosphere so that the everlasting doors bring the fullness of glory onto the earth rather than they continue getting blocked. You know, we see what we call revivals or moves of God, and we see an everlasting doors open and there's a manifestation on the earth, but very often eventually that gets blocked off because of people's falling out, not correctly relating with one another, and the enemy uses our disagreements and unforgiveness and bad attitudes and other things to block off those doors. You know, I saw it. You know, my very first encounter in heaven, I was actually taken and shown one of these everlasting doors. It was like a huge portal thing that was open, and it was like this wonderful golden glory was pouring out through it, and it was just like, wow. And then I was taken through the atmosphere just to see how these things were blocked off and what gave the enemy authority to block them off. You know, because we don't want the glory of God poured out and it lasts for 3 months and then that's it, it stops, or even 3 years. We want an ongoing heaven on the earth in those places, which is not temporary, you know, and I believe that's why God wants us to administrate it. In the past, most of it has been, you know, the prayers of the saints and the desires of the saints have filled up certain bowls and therefore they can be poured out. You know, it's the whole harp and bowl type teaching or whatever. And I believe there are bowls that are the prayers of the saints, and the pouring out of that was so strong that, you know, it caused revival on the earth. But generally then those things have got then affected and stopped, and the enemy just closes them off again. Now some of them we would call ancient wells, you know, and sometimes those revivals that have taken place, again, that they're recorded, that is stored in the ground, in the land, in the places, and God wants to unblock ancient wells, but he also wants to dig some new ones in some new places, and to establish some more of heaven filling the earth. I think the focus is, let's not get too caught up with what the enemy's doing, but let's make sure we know what God is calling us to do, and that has a greater authority. But sometimes we have to deal with some things that are recorded past events to enable us to remove the legal rights that the enemy might have over a land. I mean, sacrifice is a hugely powerful thing, but we obviously have access to the greatest sacrifice, the most powerful sacrifice, which was Jesus and his blood. But where sacrifice has been made, particularly human sacrifice, you know, a lot of satanic ritual abuse type stuff is sacrificial to give people power, and there is power associated with it. And you get a biblical picture of that in Kings. I think it's 2 Kings 3, where the kings came together, and Elisha had water came supernaturally, and they went to take back the land, and they came up against, I think it was the Amalekites, and they went to the city, and they conquered the land and came up all around the land. And then the king of that city, which they were just about to take, sacrificed his son on the walls of the city. And literally, in the original Hebrew, the ground opened up, and demonic forces came forth, and all the Israel and Judah who come together in agreement, they withdrew and never took that city. So there can be powerful things in sacrifice. So if there has been sacrifice made, and often they are made in the intersection of this grid system, then we really need to deal with that. And sometimes we need to do a court case, sometimes we need to legislate in it to make sure that we remove the legal rights that have been established on that ground through the sacrifice and other things that have happened. Then we then begin to see the positive things done. I'm all for keeping focused on God and what He's doing, but sometimes you do have to deal with when you're shown some judicial legal things so that we can administrate correctly God's authority in these things. So yeah.
Can you tell us where the I'm getting an echo.
What is it you want to ask?
Can you explain the everlasting doors and where they are and how they work?
Yeah. Okay. Well, everlasting doors are between the realm of the kingdom of God and the atmosphere of the earth, and they are the everlasting doors described in Psalm 24. Be lifted up, O you heads, O you gates, be lifted up, you everlasting doors, that the King of glory may come in. And we've got lots of songs that sing about it, but really, and other names for them, you could say the windows of heaven. There's also another name describing the same basic thing. Now, often, because of the so significant nature of these things and how they can release heaven onto the earth, the enemy has a very strategic activity to stop it. So yes, we have the atmosphere of the earth where we have all the principalities, powers, rulers, forces of darkness, which are territorially responsible for certain areas. They're also what's called the kings, false kings, that try and intimidate the use of those gates and try and block our use of those gates. And we have those in description of the ites nations, all the Ammonites and the Moabites and all the other ites that are referred to, which had some sort of Nephilim seed engagement and were the giants that were eventually wiped out of the land eventually in David's time. But it's not just a simple thing of, right, okay, yeah, we're going to open up all these gates and everything's going to be wonderful. It's like we have to administrate what comes through it. We have to legislate what comes through it. As sons, we need to be those who are taking responsibility for those areas, and we need to clear the atmosphere. And to do that, you have to deal with the things that are operating in the realm of the kingdom, so the giants, dragons, spiritual forces there, which empower the atmosphere and empower the kings. And because most people have got no idea what these things is, not many people are actually doing anything to actually legislate. Now, in times past, as I said earlier, I believe that sometimes we've seen the prayers of the saints and people praying faithfully, and you have revivals like our Hebridean revival. 2 or 3 old ladies got together for years and years and prayed and called out on God and called out on God, and a number of other past revivals. You can look back into, find out someone was praying, someone was really calling out on God, and God responded. And in those times, we look at it and think, wow, amazing, look at all these things. I believe God is calling us to a greater level of responsibility than that. And so it isn't just us asking God to do it. God is actually saying, no, I'm giving you responsibility and authority to do it. And therefore, I'm not opening these gates and doorways as I once was, because I'm now wanting you to mature to a place where you are responsible for these spheres that I've given you, these governmental areas. Therefore, we then have to learn how to do it. And so we have to learn how to legislate, how to open it, how to see the glory of God come through it. Therefore, we have to learn to deal with what's in the atmosphere and in what's in the realm of the kingdom, ensuring that we remove all legal rights and we have the authority to outwork those things. So it's not just as straightforward as saying, well, we open them. In a sense, the picture there is, be lifted up, O ye heads. So that means there has to be authority above the everlasting doors to administrate them. And it says, be lifted up, you everlasting heads and gates. So we have to be responsible for what comes through us as a gateway to open up those doors, because then it's be lifted up, you everlasting doors. And the sort of the picture of it, there are different sorts of gates and doors in the Word of God and in natural sense. This is like be lifted up, as if it's flat and not operating, and you have to lift it so that things can come through. I am sometimes called to do some stuff in preparation for those gates. I know here we have times when those gates are very clearly open, and sometimes I'm not allowed to open them because other people need to do so. So, because I'm not responsible for our solely.
Mike,
Yeah.
what's
Yeah, go on.
I'm sorry.
Carry on.
Just to expound a little bit on what the Lord is saying about what you just said, it's interesting that He is starting to call us territorial spirits. He's lifting us up as territorial spirits, as gates. Lift up your head so the King of Glory can come out. And that's just. I just wanted to interject that.
Yeah, sure. And I think there's a sense where we as spiritual beings have an eternal place where we were in the fabric of creation and described as lights or luminaries or stars, and there was a part where we had to play before we came into this realm, which is being restored, and the knowledge of that's being restored. So we're being restored back to eternal position. There are also angels and angelic beings. See, a principality is not a negative thing. It's just an area of territory. It's what's ruling in that principality that's the important thing. And if the enemy is ruling there, then he has access over that principality. And you have that described in the Word of God as like the Prince of Persia and the King of Persia, and they were both physical people but also spiritual authority that were in Persia or in that area at the time, and there are lots of them in different areas. And it's up to us to take the responsibility that we've been given. So we have a territory. We call it a sphere of government, a mountain sphere that gives us access to the everlasting doors beneath that mountain sphere and the 7 mountains that are attached to it to administrate. So that is our territory, and therefore, yes, we are territorial spirits in that sense, from the fact that as a spiritual being, I have spiritual territory which I have authority over. There are also angels that are assigned to our position that we can cooperate with in establishing the kingdom in the atmosphere. So we need to make sure that the rulers and the darkness there is removed, and we need to see that the thrones and the authorities and the powers are administered under our authority by the angelic realm, because they need to be established there. So we do have, like, I mean, I'm personally aware of our regional angel and their authority, and I've engaged with that regional angel, certainly our church angel. Definitely have connection with that. We have 3 local angels that are part of our local atmosphere that are assigned, but because the atmosphere hasn't been cleared, they're not fully able to function, because there are legal rights within our territory. So we really need to understand how to use the court system to remove those legal rights, but then we have to administrate into the atmosphere. It's like Jesus said, you sweep a house clean and you don't then get it filled, a whole lot of worse negative things come back. So I believe if we're going to tackle the atmosphere, we need to be a level of maturity to make sure that we administrate it. Because we can't just say, oh, right, great, we're taking the atmosphere out, we're going to see this, that, and the other, and then we sit back and don't do anything and expect God to look after it. Because bottom line is, he's calling us to take responsibility as sons for the earth, so that the earth can be brought into the glory, the freedom of the glory of the children of God, which is what it says in Romans chapter 8. It's into our glory. And so in that sense, do I fully understand what my glory is? Well, I think it's the image of God in me reflected. And so I believe it's the light that shines from me as a spiritual being made in the image of God. But it very clearly says that God is waiting to manifest his children, his sons, so that the whole of creation will be brought out of its bondage to corruption and brought into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. So we really need to understand who we are, our identity, our position, our authority, to begin to release that glory, which is why I don't believe many people are being called to tackle the atmosphere yet, because I don't believe that those people are ready to administrate once they've tackled it. And they have to be above it to deal with it. So we need to see people established on their mountains and their thrones and governing their own life, to see their own life filled with God's presence and the kingdom. Then I believe we are faithful in that we will start to see more and more people authorized and mandated to clear the atmosphere and rule and govern it. And that's no small thing, to be administrating a kingdom. That's why the Father has a whole heavenly host to administrate his kingdom. He doesn't do it himself. He's on the throne, but he has to send assignments and direct and give ordinances of heaven, and he then equips his sons to be co-heirs with him and joint heirs with Jesus in that role. Well, I don't know what you feel, but I feel I know sort of like a tiny little bit of what I need to know to actually enable me to ongoingly do that. No, I'm learning all the time, and this year God has told me he asked me, and it was a request rather than an order, to give him the time before I go to bed every night to legislate. So I've been doing that, and I've learned a lot, in terms of catching his heart and using the heart of God and that eternal perspective to legislate things. And my personal belief is, without an engagement with the love at an eternal perspective, which love really, righteousness, the foundation of the throne is righteousness and justice. We cannot administrate justice, and therefore to bring judgment, grace, and mercy into our spheres without having a increase engagement with love, because righteousness is love expressed in action and in position and identity. And I personally have encountered the love of God probably over the past 6 months from an eternal perspective, which has totally changed and transformed how I feel, act, think, see things. It comes through a love perspective. So I know that when I'm called to administrate and to bring judgment into things and to bring justice, it is motivated by love. And I'm not talking about love that I understand from an earthly perspective, or even agape love and God's love for me and the wonder of feeling loved and accepted and affirmed and all those wonderful things that come through the fruit of the Spirit and love from God himself, who is love. When I engaged in eternity and I went and engaged in the eternal nature of love, how God loved in eternity, Father, Son, and Spirit, in relationship, and then joy and peace and all the other wonderful things, I could not contain it, and I cannot express it in words, but it changed me and gave me a passion that I didn't have before. And, God so loved the world, he gave. And when we really experience just a fragment of how God so loved the world, it transforms our whole perspective. And so my engagement with love and my daily engagement with eternity isn't coming with these are emotions and these are feelings, but it's way, way deeper than that. And it's being, when it says Jesus, the word used in the New Testament is compassion. And the Greek word, I think, for that is spleglizomai, and it actually means being moved in the guts. And it's that type of motivation that we can get when we engage the love of God, and it totally changes. So now my approach to, okay, I need to do something judicial isn't, well, I'm going to get one over on the enemy and I'm going to put him under my feet and I'm going to put him in his place, and I don't even think about the enemy. It's not even on my radar. It's all about the result of love being demonstrated, that people will be free, people will receive, people will experience, all those type of things all come out of this encounter with love. It's not that I've got any sympathy for the enemy, but God still loves the enemy because he's love. Because he was a created being that was intimate with God and a covering cherub, and God does not have this, okay, I want to destroy the devil. The fact that the devil would end up in the lake of fire for eternity is not something that we gloat over, because God still loves. And if there was any possible way for that to change, then God would certainly, his love would facilitate that. But because of where the enemy is, that's not possible. But for us, my experience of love has just changed my whole worldview and outlook. And my passion for the harvest and preparing for the harvest has just increased so much. And so I've been legislating some of those things. I did a legislative thing where I went to the court over the harvest, and and this is the only time this has ever happened to me. I went to hear the accusations of why we were not seeing a harvest in as full a way as I believe we should be, and it was the only time God was ever the judge and the accuser. And I had to face hearing God explain why we weren't seeing a harvest. And it was really hard to take, because I had to own my lack of passion for the lost, and my lack of seeing the seriousness of hell and separation from God eternally. And one of the things God said, it was like, you value worship more than salvation. And I'm like, what does that mean? But I felt it wasn't talking about worship singing. It was talking about the focus of my life is about my relationship with God, and how wonderful that is. But actually, God so loved the world he gave. So am I willing to give for the harvest? And it was like, and I had to look at myself and say, I have to repent and renounce of all these things, because actually my heart is not in this in the way it should be. Yes, I can say I want to see a harvest, but I'm not being moved by the love of God in the way that I need to. And I received this. I accepted the accusation of all the different things that were God brought and said, and there were, you know, a whole list of them. And then God gave me and said, now you can start to legislate for growth. And I thought, oh, wow. And so I had a whole lot of things that I started declaring, and my spirit and my heart, in declaring them, the whole motive of my heart changed. It's like, you know, I'm not saying that immediately in an instant everything's just 100% as it should be, but the motive, the desire, for what God is wanting to do with that harvest, you know, why do I've got a desire to see the Joshua generation raised up? Because they're going to disciple that harvest. Why do I want to see ecclesias and cities of refuge? Because they're going to be the storehouses for that harvest. And so I can so, in a sense, be caught up in the mechanics and the building and establishing the blueprint and doing all those things, and actually miss the point of what this is all about. This is all about souls coming into the kingdom. It's always about those who are lost being found and engaging eternally in a relationship with Jesus. And, you know, we can get so actually caught up with the doing of things, which is what he was saying to me, really, then I missed the point. You know, and actually he said, you know, you're so self-satisfied with your good works that you don't realize what the God works are within it. You know, and I'm sort of, I mean, it was quite hard to take. You know, I was sort of a bit undone by it, you know, and I was seriously, you know, repentant. Now I've had to bring that here to our, you know, because God spoke to us this year about establishing places of exchange, where, you know, we have a vision of around trains and train track, equipping track, and, you know, stations of equipping and stations of ministry and things like that. And it's like, you know, he told us that we needed to find disembarkation stations, which were where we would be on the platform flagging down the train saying stop, so that people could exchange their old life for the new one, darkness for light, get a new ticket for a new train, you know, get on a new track to fulfilling their destiny. But we have this sense of, God showed us 7 areas where we would find we could exchange that. But in showing me all these areas, and I started to share and we started to seek God together, he said, and none of this will work unless your hearts are right. Because you will set up an exchange, and it could, you know, it could be a healing exchange, which is one of them, you know, which will have all different aspects of healing, which will bring people into the kingdom. One of them will be our area where we engage the poor and the disadvantaged and the addicts and stuff and things. That will be a place of exchange. But unless our heart is passionate for the lost and feels God's heart of love for the lost, then all we'll be doing is setting up some structures which won't work. So I took it to this group who we've been meeting together to seek God about this exchange, and I said, look, you know, what do you feel about this? And I shared the court case with them, and they were like, oh no. You know, so we corporately accepted responsibility for that. Now I'm sure that we're going to do that ultimately corporately as a whole church, because it's not just a few people who are evangelistic. We all need to be able to reach out and share and be in a place of exchange, because one of our places of exchange is the ecclesia, and then every single person is responsible for their neighbor, their family, their friends, those people that God has given in their circle of contacts. And are we really bothered, or are we playing church? You know, are we, you know, was it, you know, Nero fiddled while Rome burned? You know, are we just moving the deck chairs around on the Titanic? It's still going to sink, and people are going to be lost eternally. And I seriously look at this, because we have here, we reach out to people. We have, you know, anywhere from, you know, 70 to 100 people come in every day and get fed and clothed and looked after and supported in various ways. And it's to demonstrate the love of God to those people, which is great. But is our heart right? And do we have a real desire for the salvation of those people, or are we happy just giving them clothes and making them more comfortable, and they're just going to go to hell more comfortable? And actually, yes, we're called to do that good work, but that good work is supposed to point people to bring glory to God who's in heaven, the Father, not to them to think, well, oh, thank you for doing this amazing thing for me, or feeding me and giving me all this help and giving me a house to live and all this stuff, and them still going to hell. And so for us, it was like we need to really look at what we're doing and say, what's our motivation in this underlying that will cause us to do this, but we really aren't satisfied in just making people more comfortable while the ship sinks. And I really believe for a lot of churches, a lot of people, we have to take an assessment of where we are, and do we really feel God's heart? Do we really know his heart of love? Have we really encountered the love that God so loved the world with? And if we have, I don't think we'll ever be the same again, because I'm so challenged by this, and I know, generally, what God does here, I know he's going to do other places, and I know he's going to start stirring people. And we could say similarly, how concerned are we of those that we know who are still stuck in religious institutions under the coverings of men and are not crossed over into their heavenly inheritance? And are we willing to demonstrate love to them and call them out and call them to cross over and call them to come on beyond the veil? Or are we frightened, or are we afraid of rejection, or are we afraid of what they might say or what criticism we might get? Because God this year also wants to call out those, who are, I know, knowing there's more, but I've not found it yet, and some of them are needing us to legislate and call them out and to invite them and to share with them. Not in a we've got it and you haven't got it, so that attitude, but a real honest desire of love to see them come into their destiny, which we know is more than what's going on right now. Are we reaching out? Are we willing to raise up a Joshua generation? Are we willing to see more people engage? Well, who's going to call them if we're not? Who's going to actually do that if we don't? Because you have to have Joshua and Caleb called the next generation to cross over, because they had been forerunners and spied out the land and were willing to say, in spite of all the giants and everything else, this is the land that God's given us. By all means, we will possess it. And a whole generation failed to, but they then called the next generation, having been forerunners. I believe we are those forerunners. Are we calling to the next generation? Are we calling to those actually who even need to be in this now? Not just the next generation in terms of salvation, but those who need to become part of the Joshua generation and leave the Moses generation behind. Because the Moses generation died in the wilderness. Do we really want our friends, people we know, people who are dying in the wilderness and not ever fulfilling the fullness and taking possession of what belongs to them? Or are we willing to do something about it? Because it's not up to God. He's given us the responsibility. What are we doing with that? How passionate are we for sharing our testimony of what God is doing in our lives? How passionate are we for seeing salvation and people coming in out of darkness into the light, whether that be salvation or whether that be just out of the darkness of the religious institutions? What are we doing with that? Anyway, preach over. Yeah, but I've been impacted by this, so in a sense sometimes I just like, this is in my heart really. But anyway, Anyone got anything else they want to share or ask? Yeah.
Mike, I have a question.
Yeah.
I've been thinking about the cities of refuge, and I was wondering if I've heard you talk about them a few times. Could you kind of give me a picture of what that would look like for a people group in particular versus a city? The city that we live in Tennessee, it's been prophesied for years and years and years that this was a city of refuge. The understanding that I get from the city intercessors and the churches is that it is a physical, natural place where we have centers of refuge, actually, that cater to the physical needs of people. But what does it look like spiritually for either a people group or a city?
Yeah. Okay, well, if you have a mandate to establish a city of refuge, that could be a one ecclesia that is part of their blueprint, and they are the city of refuge that God is calling. There can be groups of ecclesia that come together to form a city of refuge, but it will have a God blueprint that establishes it. Essentially, what that place is, it is a beachhead of heaven engaging the earth. It is not a place of refuge where we're going to call in the refugees and the this, that, and the other. Yes, there is a sense where we will see people brought out of darkness and brought into light. Yes, it will be a place where I believe it will be a storehouse for the harvest, so I think it will be receiving a harvest, and they will come from all sorts of places depending on what the blueprint is, because it could be for a people group, it could be for a very specific function, but generally it's going to be in an area that releases and draws a harvest. Because when Joseph set up the storehouses in Egypt and then the harvest came, they took 20% of the harvest and brought it into the storehouse, and then that became the resource that actually met the needs of the rest of the world. So I believe that people will come. It will be the mountain of the house of the Lord lifted up above all the other mountains and hills, and people coming saying, we must go to the mountain of the house of the Lord, because they've got the words, they've got the life, they've got the health, they've got the finances, they've got the resources, where the whole world is in this darkness, but this is a shining example of life. And it will be operating under heavenly authority. It won't be operating under the authority of the earth. So what it'll look like, it will be like Eden, you know, in the God's garden demonstrated in our garden. It will be an embassy of heaven on earth. It will be a beachhead where we establish the kingdom there in a greater dimension than anyone's ever seen before. You know, think of every revival that's ever been, put them together and then multiply it. Because this is heaven on earth. This is not subject to the laws of earth. This is having heavenly authority. So there will be no sickness. Now you think, how is that possible? Because there's no sickness in heaven. And we're having heaven on earth. Just like Adam and Eve's garden was overlapped with Eden and had the river of life flowing through it, which was then supposed to go out and water the rest of the earth, to subdue and to rule. And therefore these will be places of administrative base where they will be equipping the harvest, the harvesting generation in the supernatural dimensions of God's kingdom power, to go out and begin to expand, because there's no end to the increase of his government. So it's not like a refuge, as in we're putting a moat around this place and we're pulling up the drawbridge and we have got this great big castle that no one can get into unless we let the drawbridge down. It's not a defensive place. It is a place of offense. We are going to take the ground by going out from this place and seeing the kingdom expand. So it may be we have an ecclesia that is a city of refuge, and in that place and in that gathering where they have got authority, this starts to take place. But as God adds the harvest to that storehouse, then that will have to grow. And that maybe just a small area in a city may then start to impact the whole city. And then it could actually impact a region. Or you may get 5 or more groups that have encountered that, and they all start to come together. And what God showed me was, it would be like sometimes there are ancient wells that get unblocked, but we're not talking about water, we're talking about oil. And then you get digging an oil well. But God was going to put a torch to it, and these would become pillars of fire. So just like the pillars of fire led the children of Israel around the wilderness as an indication of God's presence with them, these will have walls of fire. In Zechariah, it talks about the city with walls of fire. So this isn't going to have a physical wall, or it will be church without walls, but the walls will be fire, and no one can come in without going through the fire. And when we go out, we take the fire, and those fiery pillars will join up with other fiery pillars and will form a canopy of fire, which will begin to purify the atmosphere, cleanse the atmosphere, and then expand outwards to take more and more territory, because it says the glory of God will fill the earth. It also says that the mountain, or the stone cut without hands out of the mountain, will become a mountain that fills the earth. So the kingdom of God, or the house of the Lord, will fill the earth, but it won't happen unless we expand and see the kingdom do that. So I believe the initial impact of this will be to receive a harvest of 1 billion people, which is what has been prophesied. Yeah, and then we will then those billion people will be not limited to the promised land, which is what they will originally come into, but then they will actually see, well, we're supposed to be a light to the rest of the world. And so we are then going to take that and become the harvesters for the end time harvest. And, you know, I don't want to see 1 billion people saved. I want to see 7 billion people saved. You know, I want to see the world impacted by the power of God in such a way that the light is so bright that they will be drawn to it. And yes, there may be a shaking of all the things that they're now relying on, to see they don't work anymore. So, you know, and I'm not saying what those things are, but I think it's going to be a pretty different from what it is now. But we will be, you know, if you are dying of an incurable plague and you knew a place that you could go and you would be completely restored and made whole, I think you'd have a big queue lining up at your door if you were such a place. Because people will be desperate. And when we demonstrate the answers to the problems that they're going to face, then they're going to want to come. Because that's what it says in Isaiah 2. We will come to the house of the Lord, and we will teach us the word of God. Because the word of the Lord will go forth from. And we will be those that carry a higher level of governmental authority, operating, radiating light, transfigured, operating in a completely different dimension. It's quite difficult to picture it because no one's ever seen it. You know, that's why I say take everything positive that's ever happened and roll it all together and then multiply it by a lot. This is way more than we can imagine or think and have ever seen. But it all starts with someone saying, here am I, send me. Give me a mandate for an ecclesia. Give me a mandate for a city of refuge. Show me the blueprint of what it is, whether it's a physical location, whether it's reaching out to a people group. You know, I'm not putting limitations on what God can do and what these will look like, because that's up for the blueprint that you receive. But there will be physical locations, without a doubt. But they're certainly not what people will think they are. Oh, we're going to store up a whole load of food and a whole load of weapons and a whole load of things, and you know, we'll be the preppers who are ready for when everything falls apart, you know, because we will have this safe refuge. It's not like that. This is a place of equipping that people are going to come to receive the kingdom, authority, and power as the Joshua generation equips them to be the next generation, the harvesting generation, those who are going to take it out. You know, and you got other names for them: dread warriors, dread champions. You know, there have been prophetic things. I can go back into the 70s and 80s, and I remember prophetic words talked about Joel's army. You know, it talked about this, but they didn't really have a point of reference. It was all on earth without the heavenly aspect to it. Now we have to engage heaven to bring this by opening up those everlasting doors to see this manifested on the earth, which is way different than what's happened before. Anyway, so that's a little bit about it, you know, from that. But,
Thank you so much. That really helps.
okay, awesome. Okie dokie. All right, I need to leave it there.